Today I'm going to show you one of the easiest basic quilting designs, quilting with straight vertical lines. Quilting with straight vertical lines is one of the easy designs in my book, Simple Quilting, and I'll tell you more about that at the end. So when I say vertical lines, what I really mean is parallel to one of the edges of the quilt. Because obviously if you change the orientation of the piece, then they might actually be horizontal lines instead of vertical lines. And I'm going to do a sample on a little placemat to show you. This check placemat is a great practice piece because you'll be able to see how the lines interact with different squares. And if you want to make your own practice placemat, you can check on the link. So there are hundreds of options when it comes to quilting with straight vertical lines. So here are some things to think about to help you make your decision. Do you want lines in just one direction, or do you want lines going in two directions? So you can see on this quilted table runner, which is the Fill in the Blanks Junior Table Runner, it's quilted with lines just going in one direction. That really suits this pattern. This quilt, which is the blue and white twinkle, it's a variation of the twinkle sampler pattern. It is also quilted with just straight lines in one direction. And these lines are about 2¼ inches apart. On my sample placemat, I'm going to have lines going in both directions. So parallel to this edge and parallel to this edge. And I'm not going to try and do stitch in the ditch to have my straight lines, because stitching in the ditch is actually pretty difficult. It's much easier to have lines that are off somewhere else, not in the seam. So I'm going to have lines that are just offset a little bit. So not in the center of the squares, but offset from the center. So now we have to decide if we're going to mark the lines. Sometimes you can use lines that are already on the quilt for reference points. So if I wanted to use a seam guide and have it lined up with the seam, then that would be a good option. But I'm going to mark the lines right on here, and I'm going to use a hair marker. And the hair marker is perfect for marking quilting lines because it just leaves a tiny crease. It doesn't put anything chemical onto your quilt that might not come out. So I have my quilt sandwich ready, my quilt top with my batting and my backing, and then it's ready to mark with the hair marker. Don't try to use the hair marker before your quilt is basted together, because if you're marking just on a single layer of fabric, it might damage your surface underneath. So I'm going to use my quilting ruler for making straight lines, and I'm lining it up so that the 1 inch line is on the seam, and that's going to be my offset. So my quilting line is going to be 1 inch away from the seam. So I just hold the ruler, and then I just press firmly with a back and forth motion along the quilt top, and there you can see it leaves a crease that I will be able to follow along when I'm stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the rest of the quilting lines. And on the end one, I'm going to remember there's also a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is going to be 1¼ inches away from the edge. And I will turn it and do the lines in the other direction. So here you can see my piece has all the sewing lines marked directly on it. So I will use those lines to follow when I'm stitching. Now if you have a large quilt, then you're going to want to think carefully, because you don't want to have too much quilt bunched up in the throat of your machine. So you'll start in the line around the middle of the quilt, and that will have the most bulk in the throat of your machine when you're stitching in the middle. So you're going to start with the middle line and then work your way out. If it's a very large quilt, you'll probably want to start with the middle line and then go about 8 or 12 inches away, stitch that line, and that will just help hold it all securely. Then you can come in and stitch the lines in between as close as you want to go. So I'll take this to machine, and I have a walking foot in my machine, and the stitch is whatever stitch length you want. I have it a little bit longer than I would use for piecing, so it's about a 2.5, 2 3/4 stitch length. So I'm going to begin stitching with the line that's close to the middle of the quilt. And so you can see there's our first straight vertical line. Now we're going to stitch this side and then turn it around and stitch the other side. Because they're straight lines, you're going to be tempted to just push the pedal to the metal and go as fast as you can on the lines. Avoid that temptation and just stitch at a reasonable pace to avoid skip stitches and other problems with your machine. So now I have all the lines stitched in the one direction. So you can see it does look nice just like that if I wanted to leave it, but I'm going to add lines going in the other direction as well. Now, if you're having difficulty maneuvering your quilt and manipulating it in the machine, something that often helps is wearing gloves. Now these are quilting gloves that have textured on the fingers. Some people like to use gardening gloves that give a little grippiness, but just something that will help give more friction for holding your quilt and moving it. So now for this direction, we're also going to start with the line close to the middle. And there we're finished. Straight vertical lines in 2 directions. We can really see what it looks like when we look on the back. So now to finish a placemat, all we have to do is trim it off and bind it, and we have a nice fun project. For more ideas and other simple quilting designs like straight vertical lines, check out my book, Simple Quilting. You can find out about this and see other great tips and tutorials at ebitdastudio.com.